I'll see you in the land of Mordor. Death awaits you at the border. Pass on through the gates of thunder, destroy the ring of power and wonder.
Hey Lord of the Rings fans, welcome back to the channel. I am Romantical, or Roman Daisel, depending how you want to pronounce it, and today we're looking at our final chapter in the Armies of Eriador with the Empire of the Witchking, or Angmar, the Kingdom of Angmar. Run by this guy, the Witch King of Angmar. Thought Peter Jackson and his team at What a Workshop did a fantastic job designing this guy, so give a shout out to that. And I thought Middle-earth Role-Playing did a really good job fleshing out the Kingdom of Angmar, because Tolkien never really talks about it all that much. A few lines here and there in the appendices, but nothing really in depth. And that Angmar was established during the reign of Malvagil of Arthedain, that evil came to Arnor. For at that time the realm of Angmar arose in the north beyond the Enten moors. Its lands lay on both sides of the mountains, and there were gathered many evil men, orcs, and other fell creatures. So we know that the land of Angmar was not there, or did not exist, as anything more than maybe a geographical location. Even then, it probably wasn't named that, because I think Angmar means iron home, or something like that. So it didn't exist up until the 13th century of the Third Age. Tolkien describes it as being on both sides of the Misty Mountains, and the Enten moors are here. They're cut off on this map. This is the best map I could find in short notice without printing out one of my own. With Carn Dûm here in the very tip, running down into this vale, and on this side. So in part 4 of Angmar, we know that the Witch King arrived in the 13th century, and that his sole purpose was to destroy the Dunedain of the north, just because they were split into 3 successor kingdoms that were constantly warring and were the weakest, because Gondor was far stronger at this point in time than Arnor. And Sauron also had the idea that when his attack on Gondor finally came, that there would be no northern kingdom to come to the aid of Gondor, like in the War of the Last Alliance. So by destroying the northern Dunedain while they were at their weakest, it would remove one of the major obstacles to final victory. Didn't quite work out that way, even though he destroyed Arnor. He didn't destroy the line of Isildur, or the spirit of the Dunedain who emerged from the shadows to help Gondor and save the day. So Middle-earth Role-Playing does do a very good job on this, filling in many of the gaps. Others could try, but Middle-earth Role-Playing they did this for like 15 years almost, before they had to give up the license or lose the license, depending on how you look at it. So it is one of the more interesting sites in Middle-earth, simply because it's designed just to destroy the Dunedain. That's its sole purpose. Destroying the Arthedainians, Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudar, once that's done, its purpose is pretty much fulfilled. Had it been able to stay in, although it could be said that if Gondor had not finally arrived at the very end, and with help from the elves to destroy Angmar, Angmar might have thrived as a kingdom with the Witch King, and then really put pressure on the elves, especially those in Rivendell. You probably would have seen Rivendell be abandoned by this time, and possibly Lothlorien. Alright, so we're setting up with the 1640 timeline like usual, because it's usually what these books are based on. We have definitions, ethnic composition. Now, Middle-earth Role-Playing uses a very wide ethnic composition. Easterlings are brought in as mercenaries, and as mercenaries go, most of them end up either dying or staying. Very few of them would ever make it back to their homelands rich. Maybe a few would, with enough wealth to impress their fellow tribesmen or whatnot, so that they would go. So there'd be a steady stream of Easterling mercenaries heading the Grey Mountains all the way up to their eastern holdings on the Misty Mountains, and through there's probably a pass up there near Gundabad. Gundabad at this time, although orc infested, ruled by orcs, would be a vassal or a tributary state at this point. There would also be Northmen. The Northmen of the upper Anduin Vales would have been corrupted by this point. and would be sending troops over to help. And I imagine that many bandits and men fleeing from the wars, settling in Angmar on the fringes of society, would have eagerly joined. But how many people were there before the rise of the Witch King? Probably not many, probably less. It was a frontier area. It's in a barren area. Not much in terms of farming, agriculture to survive. Harsh winters, and not much in terms of agriculture. So the ethnic composition would indeed be mostly Easterling with some Northmen thrown in. Because the Middle-earth role-playing doesn't deal with a lot with population figures, but Angmar would not have a huge population itself. And we'd probably be mostly concentrated as far as the managed population goes on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains, at least the Vale, the Anduin Vale that they control. Now this article says that you could construe it as a military state with slaves that tend the fields and a small warrior caste. Problematic because it adds the danger of a slave revolt and makes Angmar seem more Saronic to Dunedain and Elves. Self-motivated subjects is far more suited to the Witch King's need rather than an oppressive slave state. Also helps the morale. If a fighter joins Angmar's army, survives long enough, and is granted a piece of his own land, because after 1409, Angmar controls Rudar outright and could settle potential soldiers in Rudar, which has more agriculture. So like I mentioned, all inhabitants of the Westlands were dissatisfied with Dunedain rule, who would have seen their fortune in a new realm without Dunedain overlords, so those beyond the pale of civilization. People from the east willing to seek their fortune in a foreign land due to overpopulation, religious persecution, advanced taxation, etc. in their own. Subtle cooperation among major Saronic leaders like the other Nazgul could have taken place. Lands they control in the east could have sent a tithe of warriors. And the Romans did the same thing. Whenever they came across what they considered barbarians, there was usually, in the peace treaty, there was usually a tithe of warriors to help fill the Roman legion ranks, the Federati. The Federati, however you pronounce that. So now we're looking at area. Angmar is a total of 77,000 square kilometers, of which 69,700 is on the western side, and then 8,000 is on the eastern side. Now the Estevari are the Northmen, living on the eastern side, and they give a timeline of what would be wild, waste, yield, density, urban, and population for the Estevari themselves, who are a Northman tribe living on the eastern side, and their population goes from 92,000 down to just under 74 during the Great Plague to up to 109 during the peak. These same Northmen would later be driven out by the Aethiod, who, moving from the mid-Anduin Vales, would move up after the fall of the Witch King. And the population of eastern and western Angmar varies too. So in the west you'd have 505,000 in 1400 to 325,000 in the Great Plague to back to 551,000. I think that's pretty high myself, despite and that's just managed totals. That's not Orcish totals. Like I said, that's pretty high for an area like this. And down here, most of the managed settlements would be along this river, or most of the arable land would be along that river, and possibly in the northern Entmoors. Although the Vale is protected by the wind for the most part, it would still be too cold, and it's on a plateau, so it's pretty dry. So unless there's a major campaign going on, Angmar would rely mostly on indigenous forces to harass the Dunedain of Arthedain, and then when there's a major campaign being planned, they would bring in massive numbers of men from the east, and also tributary Orcs. After a campaign, most of the survivors return home, though some would remain, replenishing Angmar's losses. So you have short-term auxiliaries, so the mercenaries, and then Crusaders. I don't know how well the Crusaders is. That's something I think they take out of our own history. Tolkien doesn't mention Crusaders. So the size. Compared to Arthedain, Angmar would have one knight for every 190 people, one men-at-arms for every 90 people, 1 yeoman for every 55 people, and the same 1 to 5 militia. Now, most of the people might live in Carndum, the capital city, which was a major fortress. But there are also a line of fortresses down this river, according to MERP roleplay. Morkay, Shadun, I can't remember the other two. There's like 4 major fortresses defending the Vale of Angmar, or the Gap of Angmar. And there's Eldaner Fortress, which was taken from the Dunedain in the early years. So they definitely need to keep control over areas. Nathvaragla might be another one, down here in the plain. So with the Witch King's major military focus and goals, there's going to be a high military... It's going to be a militarized state. Therefore, you have like 2% of your population are full-time soldiers, and an additional 20% for the full levy might be reasonable. And then you got to add orcs. The orcs of Angmar. They would be restrained from attacking the men of Angmar, and would be kept separate as much as possible. And then you don't have to supply them as much, because their mode of subsistence is entirely different and independent on an agrarian basis. So in the Empire of the Witch King and the Angmar modules, there are supposedly 30 tribes directly controlled by the Witch King, of which 12 are arrayed along the Arthedain border to help from the north all the way on the east. And they're there to harass, raid, and just make life difficult for the Dunedain of Arthedain. They're to pin down the Arthedain forces and don't allow Arthedain much room to maneuver. So they're like the first line of orcs. Then you have the other border tribes. Now this does not include the tributary states like Goblin Gate and Gundabad, which are independent. These are too big for the Witch King to directly control unless he goes there in person to assume control. And he's not going to waste time like that. Not when Gundabad and the goblins of the High Pass are more than willing to send troops. So this is what the article comes up with. The potential Angmaran military strength in 1400 of the Third Age, just before the Second Northern War. You have like 131,000 men, potentially. It slips to around 87,000 during the Great Plague, and then rises back up to just under 145,000 by the last campaign. Orcs, you have border orcs, Angmar tribes, and tributary tribes. So tributary is Gundabad and the goblins of the High Pass. Potentially, you could get over 37,000 orcs, and then by the Great Plague, 25,000 orcs, and then at the end, 45,000. So the potential is 168,000 by the Second Northern War, 113,000 in the Great Plague, and roughly 190,000 in the final campaign. But again, how many would he actually be able to raise? Yes, you can raise all these troops, but can you send them all at once? No, then you weaken your own borders. If you lose badly, then there's a collapse. They're saying that roughly 75% of the core army, knights, men-at-arms, yeomen, Estaravi warriors, and orcs, goes to war with the rest. Mostly the young and oldest warriors guard Angmar. Even a substantial number of militia is called to a campaign in faraway Arthedain, so 15%, simply because they're fodder. They would protect supply lines. Angmar's got a huge supply line problem. Even though they'd be raiding the countryside, any scorched earth policy would be devastating for an Angmaran army. And to keep it well supplied, you would need a huge logistical train. So the medieval style army in winter on a relatively barren landscape simply do not permit this, and this contingency places a maximum limit on the size of an Angmaran army. So for the actual campaign strength in 1409, during the fall of Amansul, just under 57,000 men and around 28,000 orcs. I would assume there'd be more orcs, but then there's a quote in Fellowship of the Ring that talks about something like that. When the hobbits were captured by the Barrow Wights and Tom Bombadil rescues them, one of the things Mary says is that, of course I remember, the men of Carndum came at us at night and we were worsted. Ah, the spear in my heart. He gets a vision of the final battle in the Barrow Downs with the the army of Cardolan against the forces of the Witchking. So after the army of Cardolan was defeated and pushed back from Amansul, part of the Witch King's host went and chased them, followed up, which is a classic military move. You follow up your victory, and you don't give your enemy time to regroup. It's one of Napoleon's mistakes during the Waterloo campaign. He didn't keep in contact with the Prussian army after its defeat at Ligny. The Prussians retreated. Napoleon turned to go after the British, and the Prussians were able to regroup. I think Napoleon sent Marshal Grouchy with a corps, but they were to pin down the Prussians or keep them busy. But too many contradictory orders and didn't know exactly where they were. Didn't help. So the Prussians were able to reach the Waterloo battlefield in the early evening, which influenced the later decisions of Napoleon. And then by the Great Plague, you only have 38,000 men for a major campaign, and then 19,000 orcs. And then by the fall of Arthedain, you got 70,000 men and 33,000 orcs, roughly. Now those are huge armies, but the quality would be different. The Dunedain are physically stronger than orcs and men that Angmar has. I always thought there'd be more orcs than men, but if you think about it, if the men are really badly defeated, the managed part, then the orcs might fall upon them. The problem with orcs is you bring your own worst enemy with you, unless the Witch King is there personally. In the Angmar books by Merp, they have 6 major generals, 1 who's the head and 5 who control certain regions, and they're all vying for attention. So you have good military commanders, but they're also trying to outdo each other and get rid of rivals, which is counterproductive. An Angmaran army would lose a lot of men simply due to disease like dysentery, typhoid like water would be a huge problem. Arthedain, like I said, could use a scorched earth policy to keep supplies from falling in the hands of the Angmaran. They would have to send out raiding scouting parties, and they could be easily waylaid. Tactics. Because they use so much mini militia used for foraging and provisioning, the core of the army by scouting the countryside. They wage war in the winter simply because farmers are more readily available. The Northmen resemble Germanic, so they're individualistic fighting style without great regard for discipline or refined tactics. Orcs would be like that too. From a discipline point of view, there wouldn't be a lot of discipline within the vast majority of Angmar's host. It's one of the reasons why the Romans were able to defeat many of their enemies despite being outnumbered. Now the Witch King would have a large degree of horse cavalry, the plains culture, and the cavalry are the best troops, the good discipline, careful reconnaissance, skilled horse archers. The deadly feign retreat that the Mongols were always great at, but the Arthedain after all this time, would have such good discipline that it wouldn't work that well. Now the Witch King did create a buffer zone against Arthedain. All settlements in the region were systematically destroyed. Any attempt to resettle them quenched. So this was Eldaner Keep. It's out in the high up in the north. King's Crag was also heavily raided and devastated. It's on the tip of the North Downs. It points like a spearhead towards Angmar. The northern Olead would be also depopulated. And the Witch King also erected a number of smaller fortresses and castles just behind the no man's land, sufficient to deter any Arthedain Cardolan attack. And I mentioned a few of them like Sheldun, Morkay, Angsel, and there's one more I'm missing. Angmar did not really show their strength in the First Northern War. They portrayed themselves as a new weak state that was a junior partner to Rudar. And then shortly after the First Northern War, it showed its true colors and basically took over Rudar by 1409. Alright, so they go into the First Northern War. Then the Second Northern War is a little more... Angmar shows its full strength. And again, the Dunedain of Arthedain and Cardolan badly misjudge the strength of Angmar. In that war, Angmar's main goal might have been the fortress of Amansul, because it's also symbolic. it's also the key lynch point to Arthedain and Cardolan, one of them. Like, it controls the east-west road. And by taking Almansul, they might have gotten a Palantiri. And then they can get underneath the soft underbelly of Arthedain, because Arthedain was defended by the North Downs and the Weather Hills. Natural barriers. Angmar came the east-west road, hit Almansul. Because they won that battle, they were able to push the Arthedain army north. Cardolani army went west. Angmar followed up going west and hitting the Cardolani army, and then turned its attention north. Arthedain was allowed to reorganize in a series of battles around Fornost, but raiding parties would have hit what was now the Shire, or what was to become the Shire, and might have even got as far as Anonymous. While northern Cardolan was also ravaged, but the Elves of Linden and Rivendell attacked the Angmarin in the rear, cutting off their supply lines and encircling the Nazgul Lord's army. They were utterly defeated, though Cardolan was broken. The Great Plague didn't affect Angmar as much as it would the Cardolani and the Arthedinians. Now, they do mention something that's totally a Merp creation, the Hillman Revolt and Rogrog's War. The Hillmen had enough. They revolted against Angmar's growing demands for service and subordination, plus they don't like orcs. Owing to the plague, this war strained Angmar's depleted resources. The Hillmen waged a tenacious guerrilla war and had to be exterminated tribe by tribe. After many Angmaran defeats and the use of massive reinforcements from the Iron Home, the revolt was finally crushed, and the few surviving Hillmen fled their home and were assimilated to their numerous Dain cousins in the south. It is totally a Merc creation. In the Third Northern War, it's mentioned in Peoples of Middle-earth, when King Aravel won a victory. But it says this also... Now, again, another Merp creation, they come up with the Banes of Angmar, which is like Red Flux, which is basically dysentery, hit Arthedain in the 1890s. The Blood Eye Rash swept through the Arthedain's Equian herds, and this so weakened. And the Fourth Northern War was the massive, the one final push. The Witch King should have waited, but instead, when Gondor arrived, he should have waited behind the stout walls of Fornost and the hills, but he boldly rushed out and was destroyed, probably because of supply issues. Provisioning his army, and probably didn't have enough reinforcements and wanted to hit the Gondorians while they're on the march. Once the Witch King fled, because his goal was accomplished, the kingdom of Angmar just collapsed upon itself. The Gondorians were there to mop up whatever fortresses there were, so Carn Dûm was destroyed. And his arms and armor, Angmar and Merp, which is interesting. The Merp campaign modules they have basically a 10,000 man standing army and another 5,000 cavalry is typical. While I think this article overestimates Angmaran population and strength, it is plausible, and it's a good foundation to use for any Angmaran force. So that's a look at Angmar. So what I think of the army of Angmar, I think the numbers are too high, and there probably should be more orcs than men. It doesn't even mention trolls, which the Middle-earth role-playing campaign does have. They have numbers for the trolls too. I think something like 500 trolls at the end. But I do think that the numbers are very high. But all in all, this is a very good article and a very good reference. So all you Middle-earth role-playing fans and Lord of the Rings fans in general, let me know your thoughts on the Army of Angmar. Do you think it's too many, too few? What are some of the holes in this plot for this article? And in general, what do you think of this article? Is it a good resource for a military campaign? Does it make sense? Leave comments in the comment section. Leave a like. Subscribe if you're new to the channel. And until next time, I'm Romantical. I'm out of here.
Shadows increasing, beats throughout the land, they ceasing, evil mist flows through the valley, silence wearing never ceasing. From out this barren empty land, nations formed from brick and sand, now is almost as before, peace in Middle Earth no more. fail. Ring must end volcano.